All right, so chapter 1 of Everything on a Waffle. I could not find the PDF online, so that's a job for me today. So we're going to have to try to read like this. Please tell me whether this worked well, worked great, or did not work at all. I have no idea. So, enjoy the book. My parents are lost at sea. I live in Cole Harbour, British Columbia. I have never lived anyplace else. My name is Primrose Squarp. I'm 11 years old. I have hair the color of carrots in an apricot glaze. Recipe to follow. Skin fair and clear where it isn't freckled, and eyes like summer storms. One June day, a typhoon arose at sea that blew the rain practically perpendicular to our house. My father's fishing boat was late getting in, and my mother, who wasn't one for sitting around biting her nails, put on her yellow mackintosh and hat and took me over to Miss Perfidy's house, saying, "Miss Perfidy, John is out there somewhere, and I don't know if his boat is coming safely into shore, so I am going out in our sailboat to find him." Well, a thinking person might have told my mother that if a big fishing boat wasn't going to make it through the waves, our little skiff sure wasn't. But Miss Perfidy wasn't one to waste time in idle chit-chat. She just nodded, and that was the last I saw of my mother. The fishing boat never came back to shore. Neither did the skiff. So all that June, I continued to live with Miss Perfidy. There was a memorial service for my parents, but I wouldn't go. I knew that my parents hadn't drowned. I suspected that they had washed up on an island somewhere and were waiting to be rescued. Every morning, I went down to the docks to watch the boats come in, sure that I would see my parents towed in, perhaps on the back of a whale. "I don't know what you think the story of Jonah is about, Miss Perfidy," I said, "but to me it is about how hopeful the human heart is. I am certain my parents, if not in the belly of a whale, are wondering how I am doing and trying to get home to me." I called the last few words out in the direction Miss Perfidy had gone. She often stalked off when I was in the middle of a sentence. It didn't encourage many heartfelt confidences. I didn't mind Miss Perfidy's exits, but what I did mind was her mothball smell, which was never overwhelming, yet hovered around her in a little fog. Mothballs spilled from her every drawer in her house. I couldn't understand why Miss Perfidy seemed to be the only person in town who had such a huge problem with moths. You guys know that mothball smell? One day, I got out a box and read the directions. "You know, Miss Perfidy," I said, is it possible that you misunderstood the directions? You seem to be using an awful lot of mothballs." But Miss Perfidy had already left the room. Besides, it wasn't really any of my business. The town council was paying Miss Perfidy her usual babysitting fee of $3 an hour from what they called the Squarp's estate and what I called my parents' bank account until they could figure out what to do with me. This was taking them a lot longer than it might have because my parents hadn't made wills or thought ahead to the day when they would both disappear at sea. But even I knew that at $3 an hour, I wasn't long for life with Miss Perfidy. One member of the town council argued that $3 an hour was a lot to pay a babysitter for those endless night hours when I was asleep, and Miss Perfidy was snoring in her own bed. But it was fruitless to argue with Miss Perfidy. She was mean with money. In Cole Harbour, there was whaling and fishing and the Navy. If you didn't whale or fish or do naval things, you had to do what you could to hold body and soul together. So Miss Perfidy was tight with her pennies by necessity. When things had gotten too tight a few years back, she had sold her small cottage and bought an even smaller cottage. Before she moved from the small cottage, she dug up her flower bulbs, one by one, tulip, crocuses, and not being a real... She pulled up her flowers one by one, tulips, daffodils, crocuses, and not being a real stinker, neatly filled in all the holes again. When the realtor heard about it, he came charging over. "Miss Perfidy," he had said, "you can't do this. People expect you to leave your flowers." but she said she had paid for and planted every last bulb, and she was taking every last bulb. And speaking of bulbs, she was also unscrewing and taking all the light bulbs. Land sakes, did he want her to leave her clothes for the new owners too? Toward the beginning of August, when the town council finally decided to invite me to a meeting to discuss my fate, they sent Miss Honeycutt, the school guidance counselor, to escort me and Miss Perfidy. Miss Honeycutt was the closest thing Cole Harbor had to a psychiatrist, which wasn't really very close at all. Everyone knew that Miss Honeycutt was born to the British aristocracy, and was going to inherit half of Yorkshire, England, when her father, still kicking around 83, died. People were very, very nice to her because they thought that maybe someday she would remember them in her will, or at least invite them to visit her manor house in Yorkshire when she finally got her mitts on. Only my mother had avoided Miss Honeycutt. She said that despite Miss Honeycutt's vast global experience, she was a bore, that she talked exclusively in anecdotes and couldn't converse like normal people, and that the reason she was stuck way across the world in Cole Harbor was that it was the only place she could get a job, and that because her father knew the principal of Cole Harbor Elementary. But I wished I could hear more about the places Miss Honeycutt had traveled and the things she had seen. I remember her telling my mother that as a little girl she had learned to play bridge riding a train through China. It didn't seem fair that when she was my age, she had already learned more about the world than perhaps I would ever have the chance to. When Miss Honeycutt came to the door, Miss Perfidy and I were ready. Miss Perfidy was wearing a very old tweed suit and carrying a black patent leather handbag over her forearm. Miss Perfidy knew that no one would want to tussle with someone in such a Queen of England get-up, and that this gave her quite the upper hand. She was never happy unless she had the upper hand. Unfortunately, neither was Miss Honeycutt, and she looked at Miss Perfidy as a tuna fish had just died on her foot. All the way to the meeting, Miss Honeycutt kept saying how sorry she was that my parents had died, and she said died in a very pointed way until I finally explained she must be mistaken, and I was content to wait for my parents' return, no matter how long it took. Miss Honeycutt said that this was a most unrealistic attitude and that I must think of my future. Miss Perfidy didn't say anything the whole way there, but sniffed disapprovingly at both of us. In the meeting hall, we took seats near the front, waiting for more people to drift in. Miss Perfidy continued to sniff. She sniffed so heartily, people in rows forward and back of her began sniffing to detect what Miss Perfidy smelled. Soon, nearly everyone was sniffing. "They've all got colds," grumbled Miss Perfidy, turning to look accusingly at me. "Big crowd packed into a small hall. We're all going to get sick now." I didn't know what to say, so I looked at my feet, then got out my mom's memo pad, which I kept in my back pocket. It had fallen out of my mother's raincoat when she left me at Miss Perfidy's. There wasn't much in there, just a recipe for carrots in an apricot glaze and an old grocery list. The rest of the pages were blank. I read and reread the recipe as we sat waiting for the meeting to start. When the last person had drifted in and had a sniff, Miss Honeycutt started the meeting by saying that my parents' bank account was dwindling, and, as imperfect an arrangement as she thought it might be to have me move in with a relative I didn't even know, the town council must try to summon my next of kin, Mr. Jack Dion, because, after all this time, he was the only kin that could find any reference to, and no one else was volunteering to take me in. Well, good luck to you, I thought, because the one time my mother had mentioned Uncle Jack, her brother, to me, she had said he was a drifter. Old Hotfoot Jack, she called him. Miss Honeycutt had found out that he was in the Navy now, stationed all the way across the country in Halifax, Nova Scotia. I figured it would be a miracle if he ended up in Cole Harbor, but that's exactly what did happen. After the meeting, the council contacted Uncle Jack at sea and said he couldn't come. But immediately after that, the Navy shifted everyone around, and he got shifted right onto the base in Cole Harbor, which the town council thought was very fortunate as he could take care of this mess, by which they meant me. As soon as Uncle Jack arrived, he was whisked off to a town council meeting. When Uncle Jack, who was tall and mustached, broad-shouldered, blond, and ruddy, walked into the room, Miss Honeycutt eyed him thoughtfully. This surprised me because Uncle Jack looked like a pig, albeit a lean, good-looking pig, whereas Miss Honeycutt looked more like a turtle. It was hard to imagine a pig and a turtle together, but it gave me something to do through the rest of the meeting. The council reminded Uncle Jack that I was still hanging out at Miss Perfidy's, waiting to be claimed and costing $3 an hour. Uncle Jack seemed confused when they told him this. He had assumed that when he said no, the town council had found some other relative or guardian for me. He explained that he was a training officer and had just moved into a small house connected to the gym on the base. It was very convenient for him because he taught classes in the gym and worked out there every day, but he wouldn't be allowed to keep a child there. If he wanted to do that, he would have to move to the family housing part of the base, and he really didn't want to do that. The town council looked horrified when he told him this. They had wanted him to go all gooey when he saw me. I didn't. I admired his honesty. After all, we both have lives already in gear. The meeting dragged on because, as usual, there were 3 people who loved to hear themselves talk and wouldn't shut up, and it took the moderator a long time to figure out that none of them had anything to say. They exhausted everyone so much that the most they could be decided was that Uncle Jack should think about things, and they left it at that. Everyone broke for cake and coffee. Miss Honeycutt noodled her way up to Uncle Jack with an extra piece of cake. What he was supposed to do with it, I didn't know because he already had a piece on his plate and another jammed up his cheek. Since I had finished my piece, I said I'd take it. Miss Honeycutt gave me a look. She handed me the cake, though, since Uncle Jack was watching. Then, Miss Honeycutt started telling Uncle Jack that she never thought he should have been asked to take a child on. How she felt it was an awful imposition for a bachelor, relative, or no, ho, ho, ho. How he needn't feel bad about not being up to the challenge. Uncle Jack looked at her coolly when she said that. Miss Honeycutt went off swiftly. An officer's job was challenging enough, she knew. Her father had been an officer. It was such a startling about-face position that I stood with my mouth hanging slightly open, full of half-eaten cake. Miss Honeycutt went on to say how there were many excellent foster homes for children like me, and people did, despite what you heard, frequently adopt the older child, and that's when Uncle Jack put his arm around me and said he had decided to take care of me himself. It was a nice, warm hug, and the first real human contact I had had since this whole business began. And it was comforting, even though I knew he had only done it to spite Miss Honeycutt. Don't worry, I said to Uncle Jack later on. I don't expect it to be for long. I'm sure my mother and father will be here any time now. Then, the Navy sent in its Coal Harbor troops on a peacekeeping mission and announced the government's decision to close down the base permanently. The town thought Uncle Jack was going too, and they were back to square one. That's when he surprised everyone by quitting the Navy, getting into real estate, and buying the house connected to the gym on the base. It was, he said, a good deal because he got the gym thrown in for free. He really loved that gym. And so, I ended up with my clothes and things in 3 houses. The house that Uncle Jack bought, Miss Perfidy's house, where I continued to keep the sweaters that my mom had knit for me so they would be moth-free, and my own house, which Uncle Jack put up for rent. It sent me deeper into a funny, detached, dreamlike state. I do not live anywhere anymore, I said to myself on one of my walks down to the pier to wait for my parents. I am not in the body of life. I hover in the extremities. I float. Okay, here's our recipe. Carrots in apricot glaze. Take a package of carrots and scrape them. Chop the carrots into bite-sized pieces. Open a tin of apricots, save them for something else, and pour the juice into the pan with the carrots and a little water. Add 2 tablespoons of butter and 3 tablespoons of brown sugar. More if you like them sweeter, less if you don't. Boil them until the carrots are tender, adding water if the liquid starts to disappear, and a glaze appears before the carrots are cooked. The liquid should boil down and turn into a glaze just as the carrots become tender. Okay, there's chapter 1 of Everything on a Waffle. What I would like you to do is tell me at least 3 characters from that chapter. And my challenge is get some carrots, get some apricots, and cook the recipe. Please let me know whether you enjoyed that chapter, and have a great day.